pause to thank what is arguably the coldest day of the year so far. So we're going to start off with some overview remarks, and then you'll ask questions. Depending on where he leaves off, that may direct who asks the first question, sort of deciding the groups that want to pose the questions, and we'll go from there. Okay?
All right, thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be here and see you all. It's very gratifying to know that so many of you have been using my book and working on projects related to it. So I'm happy. I'm really here mostly to answer questions, and I always enjoy doing that. So feel free. But Mr. Miller asked me to talk for a little bit about sort of what I'm doing now, actually, because I'm working on another book. It is not about Lincoln at all, but in the same vague general ballpark, and sort of how a historian gets involved or chooses the topic, and then how I pursue it. I'm currently finishing a book, actually, about the Underground Railroad in New York City. It's a local study. It's easier. You don't have to go anywhere to do your research. But about fugitive slaves who passed through New York City, what happened to them, who helped them, where they came from, and where they went, and what legal issues related to that, street battles related to that, all sorts of interesting things. And it's amazing, everyone's heard of the Underground Railroad in a kind of vague sort of way. Very, very little has been written about the Underground Railroad in New York City. And the reason for that is something that I mentioned briefly in the Lincoln book, which many of you probably know, is that New York was pretty much a pro-slavery city before the Civil War. New York was very tied into the slave South. New York merchants pretty much controlled the cotton trade, shipping cotton from the South to either the North or to England. The New York banks financed a lot of the expansion of slavery. New York insurance companies sold insurance policies on slaves. Interesting thing, the owner bought a life insurance policy on the slave, but if the slave died, the slave's family didn't get the money. The owner got the money. New York companies were selling these. So New York, the economy in New York was very tied into the slave South. In fact, when New York seceded, the mayor, when the South seceded, the mayor, Fernando Wood, who you may remember if you saw the Lincoln movie, is one of the members of the House of Representatives who was very anti-abolition. The mayor proposed that New York City secede also, not to join the South, but to become what he called a free city, so it could trade with both North and South, whatever happened in the Civil War. Frankly, many of us think New York City should secede nowadays, given what's happening in many other parts of this country, but we'll leave that aside. So it was hard to be an abolitionist in New York City. There were very few abolitionists in New York City. It was hard for fugitive slaves. If they got to New York, they had to get out because there were slave catchers all around. There were Southerners coming up to vacation in New York City. Many of the hotels specialized in dealing with Southerners. A fugitive slave might run into his owner on the street one day. It's happened. So anyway, so everything happened in secret. And that makes it a little harder, more interesting, but harder to investigate. It's like doing a big jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and you can never find them. But you can still get an outline of what happened if you work hard enough. I got interested in this because up in the Columbia Library, where I teach, they have the papers of a guy named Sidney Howard Gay. No reason you should have heard of him. He was an important journalist in the 19th century, an abolitionist, and then later worked on the New York Tribune, a leading newspaper. And in Gay's papers up there is a book or something, a record he kept called Record of Fugitives. He was basically running the Underground Railroad in New York City in the 1850s, and for 2 years he kept a detailed record of all the fugitive slaves who came through New York City, where they came from, who owned them, how they got to New York, how he helped them, how much money he spent, giving them money for lodging or clothing or tickets to get out to the further north or to Canada. And it's an amazing record. It's never been published. It's just sitting there. About 220 slaves are listed in there over 2 years. And that's pretty average. I think about 100 slaves a year passed through New York City, fugitives, from about 1830 to 1860. That's about 3,000, let's say, over the 30 years before the Civil War. 3,000 is not enough to dent the institution of slavery that much. There were 4 million slaves on the eve of the Civil War. Nonetheless, most of them, as you might imagine, came from the Upper South. They came from Maryland, they came from Delaware, they came from Virginia. Nobody from Alabama is escaping and getting all the way up to New York City or Mississippi, too far. But in those areas that were near the North, it was a significant loss to many slave owners, slaves just running away. So anyway, so I'm sort of trying to track where they came from, who helped them. There was sort of a pathway where they came through Philadelphia. There was a whole committee there helping them, sent on to New York, then up to Albany, Syracuse, Canada. It's not highly organized. One shouldn't think of this, sometimes you think of the Underground Railroad as stations and agents and schedules. No, it's not like that. It's much more disorganized, ad hoc. But nonetheless, there were little networks of people around. And basically what I found is there's two groups that basically are helping fugitive slaves the most. One is Quakers. Quakers, as you probably know, were very anti-slavery. They were the first white abolitionists in America in the colonial period. There weren't a lot of them in New York, but a lot of the people helping them, white people, were Quakers. And the other is free black people. Philadelphia, New York, upstate, there were these free black communities, not that gigantic, but those are the people really assisting fugitive slaves. And if a fugitive got to New York, you might imagine the first person he'd look to for help was a black person. He'd go up to a black person and say, well, hey, what do I do